On the 3rd of July, 1999, the first rays of dawn crept over the jagged peaks of Khalubar in the Kargil sector, illuminating a landscape that would soon be christened with blood and valor. Captain Manoj Pandey stood at the base of the towering ridge, his eyes tracing the impossible gradient that his men would have to conquer. The 24-year-old officer from the 1st Battalion 11th Gorkha Rifles knew that what lay ahead was not merely a military operation, but a test of human will against the cruelest topography and the most entrenched enemy positions that the Indian Army had faced in decades. The Kargil conflict had erupted in May of 1999, when Pakistani soldiers and militants disguised as mujahideen had infiltrated across the line of control and occupied strategic heights on the Indian side. These mountains, soaring between 14,000 and 18,000 feet above sea level, provided the perfect vantage points to dominate National Highway 1 Alpha, the critical artery connecting Srinagar to Leh. The intrusion was a strategic masterstroke that caught Indian intelligence off guard. And now, weeks into the conflict, the Indian Army was paying a heavy price to reclaim every inch of its sovereign territory. Captain Pandey had already earned a reputation as an officer who led from the front. Born on the 25th of June, 1975, in Sitapur, Uttar Pradesh, he had grown up listening to stories of military heroism from his father, who himself had served in the army. Young Manoj had cleared the National Defense Academy examination and joined the Indian Military Academy in Dehradun, where his leadership qualities and tactical acumen had marked him as an exceptional officer. His coursemates remembered him as someone who never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself, a quality that would define his actions in the battles to come. According to reports from the Times of India and various military accounts documented in the years following the Kargil War, the Batalik sector where Khalubar was located presented some of the most challenging terrain and heavily fortified enemy positions. The Pakistani forces had spent months preparing these bunkers, stocking them with ammunition, supplies, and automatic weapons. They had the advantage of height, pre-positioned defenses, and the element of surprise that had given them time to dig in deep. The mission assigned to Captain Pandey's Charlie Company was to capture Khalubar, a strategic feature that dominated the surrounding area. Intelligence reports indicated that the enemy had established multiple bunkers connected by trenches, with interlocking fields of fire that would turn any advancing force into targets in a shooting gallery. The gradient was so steep that soldiers would have to climb using their hands and feet, making them vulnerable at every step. Adding to the challenge was the altitude, where the thin air made every breath a struggle and every movement exhausting. As Captain Pandey briefed his Gorkha soldiers that morning, he looked into faces weathered by weeks of combat. These men had already fought in multiple engagements, had seen friends fall, and yet their eyes reflected an unshakable determination. The Gorkhas, known for their ferocity in battle and loyalty unto death, would follow their young captain into hell itself if he commanded. What none of them knew was that Khalubar would demand exactly that sacrifice. The battle plan was straightforward in concept but terrifying in execution. They would launch a night assault, climbing under the cover of darkness to minimize exposure to enemy fire. Artillery would soften the enemy positions, but the final capture would require close combat, the kind where men looked into each other's eyes before one fell. Captain Pandey knew that leadership in such conditions meant being the first up that mountain, the first to face enemy fire, the first to inspire courage when fear threatened to paralyze. On the night of the 3rd of July, 1999 at 2300 hours, Captain Manoj Pandey gave the signal, and Charlie Company began their climb up Khalubar. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the occasional flare that burst overhead, casting grotesque shadows on the rocky face. Each soldier carried over 40 kilograms of equipment, including ammunition, grenades, and rations, turning the climb into an act of pure physical endurance. The mountainside offered little purchase with loose scree that gave way underfoot and sharp rocks that tore at hands and knees. Within the first hour of the ascent, the reality of their task became brutally clear. The gradient was so severe that in some sections, soldiers had to form human chains, pulling each other up meter by agonizing meter. The thin air at 16,000 feet made breathing feel like sucking air through a straw, and several men began showing signs of altitude sickness, their heads pounding and vision blurring. Captain Pandey moved among his men, his presence a constant source of strength, helping struggling soldiers, redistributing loads and maintaining the momentum despite the mountain's resistance. The Pakistani forces occupying Khalubar were from the Northern Light Infantry, considered among Pakistan's elite mountain warfare troops. They had transformed the peak into a fortress, with bunkers hewn into solid rock and reinforced with sandbags and timber. These positions had been stocked with PKM machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. The defenders had clear sight lines down the approaches, and they had spent weeks zeroing in their weapons on likely attack routes. Every meter of ground approaching their positions was a predetermined kill zone. At approximately 0200 hours on the 4th of July, the Indian artillery opened up, pounding the enemy positions with everything they had. The night sky erupted in flame as 105mm shells screamed overhead, impacting on the heights with thunderous detonations. The barrage was meant to suppress the enemy, destroy bunkers, and create shock and confusion. For 30 minutes, the mountain shook with the fury of high explosives, and rocks and debris cascaded down the slopes. Captain Pandey used this time to push his men up the final approaches, gaining critical ground while the enemy was forced to take cover. But when the artillery lifted, the defenders emerged from their bunkers like angry hornets from a disturbed nest. The mountainside suddenly came alive with tracer fire, the green and red streaks cutting through the darkness like deadly fireworks. Machine gun bullets ricocheted off rocks, sending stone splinters flying like shrapnel. Rocket-propelled grenades whooshed down the slope, exploding among the climbing soldiers. The carefully planned assault threatened to disintegrate into chaos as men dove for whatever cover they could find on the exposed mountainside. It was in this moment that Captain Pandey's leadership proved decisive. Instead of seeking cover, he stood up, exposed to enemy fire, and rallied his men. His voice, amplified by adrenaline and determination, cut through the cacophony of battle. He identified the primary enemy bunker that was causing the most casualties and began organizing an assault team. According to citations and witness accounts recorded by military historians, including those referenced in the book Kargil, From Surprise to Victory, by General V.P. Malik, Captain Pandey personally led a small group of Gorkhas in a flanking maneuver that would take them within grenade-throwing distance of the enemy position. The approach required crawling across open ground while machine gun fire swept overhead. Captain Pandey went first, his body pressed against the cold stone, inching forward with his assault rifle cradled in his arms. Behind him, 5 Gorkhas followed his path, trusting their lives to their captain's tactical judgment. It took them 45 minutes to cover what would have been a 2-minute walk, every second stretching into eternity as bullets cracked past and grenades exploded nearby. 2 of his men were hit during the crawl, crying out briefly before their comrades pulled them to minimal cover. When they reached a position within striking distance, Captain Pandey pulled the pin on a grenade, counted the seconds, and hurled it with precision into the bunker's firing slit. The explosion inside was muffled but devastating, and the machine gun fire ceased abruptly. Without waiting to assess the damage, Captain Pandey rushed forward, his Gorkha soldiers surging behind him with their battle cry echoing off the rocks. They reached the bunker and cleared it in brutal close-quarters combat, the confined space becoming a nightmare of gunfire, kukri blades, and desperate hand-to-hand fighting. The capture of the first bunker was a breakthrough, but it was only the beginning. Khalubar had multiple defensive positions, each one supporting the others in a deadly web. As dawn broke on the 4th of July, Captain Pandey and his surviving men found themselves in control of the lower positions, but facing an even more formidable challenge. The main enemy stronghold remained intact at the very peak, and the climb ahead was the most exposed yet. The morning of the 4th of July, 1999, revealed the full horror of what Charlie Company had endured during the night. The mountainside was littered with the detritus of war, spent cartridge casings glinting in the sun, blackened crater marks from grenade explosions, and dark stains on the rocks that told of human cost. Captain Manoj Pandey took stock of his force and realized that they had already sustained 30% casualties, yet the most difficult fighting still lay ahead. The peak of Khalubar loomed above them, and from their current position, They could see enemy soldiers moving between fortified positions, preparing for the next assault. The Indian Army's doctrine had always emphasized the importance of maintaining momentum in mountain warfare. To pause was to invite counterattack, to allow the enemy time to reorganize and reinforce. Captain Pandey knew this intellectually, but he also understood the physical and psychological state of his men. They had been climbing and fighting for nearly 9 hours without rest, food, or water. Their faces were drawn with exhaustion, their hands trembling from fatigue and adrenaline depletion. Several men were nursing wounds, field dressings already soaked through with blood, but refusing evacuation, while their captain remained on the mountain. At 0800 hours, Captain Pandey called together his junior officers and non-commissioned officers for a quick tactical conference. They huddled behind a rocky outcrop, passing around a single water bottle while studying the approaches to the summit. Lance Naik Gambhir Rai, a veteran Gorkha soldier who had fought in previous conflicts, pointed out that the enemy had created a killing ground on the only practical approach route. Any force attempting a direct assault would be channeled into a narrow corridor where 3 bunkers had overlapping fields of fire. It would be suicide, but there was no alternative route that wouldn't take days to navigate. The decision Captain Pandey made in that moment would later be studied in military academies as an example of tactical audacity born from desperate circumstances. Rather than attempting to silence all 3 bunkers simultaneously, which his depleted force couldn't achieve, he would launch a diversionary attack on the left flank while personally leading a small assault team directly up the center. The plan relied on speed, surprise, and the willingness of a few men to draw enemy fire onto themselves while others exploited the momentary distraction. Before launching the attack, Captain Pandey moved among his men, speaking to each one individually. He checked their ammunition, ensured their weapons were functioning, and looked each soldier in the eye with a confidence that belied the odds they faced. To the youngest members of his company, some barely 20 years old and experiencing combat for the first time, he offered words of encouragement. To the veterans, he offered respect and gratitude for their sacrifice. And to all of them, he offered his own example, making it clear that wherever he asked them to go, he would be going first. The assault began at 0930 hours with a sudden burst of covering fire from the diversionary team on the left flank. Automatic weapons chattered, sending bullets streaming toward enemy positions and forcing the defenders to duck below their parapets. In that brief window, Captain Pandey burst from cover and sprinted up the center approach, his assault rifle firing in short, controlled bursts. Behind him, 4 Gorkhas followed in a staggered formation, each man covering the others as they bounded forward over the broken ground. The enemy response was immediate and devastating. All 3 bunkers opened fire simultaneously, creating a crossfire pattern that should have annihilated the assault team within seconds. Bullets kicked up dust and rock fragments all around Captain Pandey as he ran, his legs pumping with superhuman effort against the gradient and the thin air. One of his team members went down immediately, hit multiple times, and killed before he could cry out. Another took a round through the shoulder but kept moving, his face contorted with pain but his weapon still firing. Captain Pandey reached a shallow depression in the ground, the only cover available, and dove into it. The depression was barely deep enough to shield a man lying flat, but it provided a momentary respite from the withering fire. From this position, only 30 meters from the nearest bunker, he could see the muzzle flashes of the enemy weapons and the shapes of Pakistani soldiers moving behind their fortifications. He pulled a grenade from his vest, armed it, and rose to a kneeling position to throw it. As his arm came forward, a burst of machine gun fire caught him in the left shoulder and arm, spinning him around. The pain must have been excruciating, the bullets shattering bone and tearing through muscle and nerve, but Captain Pandey didn't cry out. Instead, according to witnesses who survived the battle and whose accounts were later documented in military records and news reports, including those from the Hindu newspaper, he switched the grenade to his right hand and hurled it toward the bunker before collapsing back into the depression. The explosion silenced one of the machine guns, and in that brief moment of confusion, the diversionary team on the left flank managed to advance and suppress another position. But Captain Pandey was grievously wounded. Blood poured from his shoulder, soaking his uniform and pooling in the rocky depression. His left arm hung useless, the bones visible through the torn flesh. Medical training dictated that he should immediately signal for evacuation, that his war was over and he had done more than enough. But as he lay there, gasping against the pain and shock, he could see that his men were still pinned down, that the assault was faltering, and that without leadership they would be forced to retreat, leaving the mountain in enemy hands. What Captain Manoj Pandey did next would earn him India's highest military honor, the Param Veer Chakra, and would enshrine his name forever in the annals of military heroism. On the 4th of July, 1999, at approximately 1000 hours, Captain Manoj Pandey made a decision that transcended military duty and entered the realm of pure sacrifice. Despite his catastrophic wounds, despite the blood loss that was already making him lightheaded and weak, despite the pain that would have incapacitated most men, he refused to accept defeat. The main enemy bunker, the key to capturing Khalubar's summit, still remained operational, its machine gun continuing to pin down his company and inflict casualties on men who looked to him for leadership and inspiration. Using his one functional arm, Captain Pandey tied a field dressing around his shattered shoulder, pulling it tight with his teeth to slow the bleeding. The makeshift tourniquet was barely adequate, but it bought him precious minutes of consciousness. He checked his assault rifle, found it still operational, and began crawling forward toward the bunker. His movements were agonizingly slow, each meter gained through sheer force of will as his body screamed for him to stop, to rest, to surrender to the darkness that was creeping into the edges of his vision. The Gorkha soldiers, seeing their captains advance despite his wounds, were galvanized into action. If their officer, bleeding and half dead, could continue the assault, how could they remain in cover? Lance Naik Gambhir Rai, who had served under Captain Pandey since his posting to the battalion, made a decision that he would later say came not from training, but from loyalty to a leader who had never asked more of his men than he was willing to give himself. Rising from his position, Rai charged forward, his kukri drawn and his voice raised in the traditional Gorkha battle cry that had struck fear into enemies for over 2 centuries. The sight of their wounded captain crawling forward and their senior non-commissioned officer charging created a wave effect that swept through Charlie Company. Soldiers who had been pinned down, who had been considering withdrawal, suddenly found reserves of courage they didn't know they possessed. They rose from cover in small groups, providing covering fire for each other, bounding forward in the classic fire and movement tactics that are easy to teach but extraordinarily difficult to execute under enemy fire. The mountainside erupted in a crescendo of gunfire as the battle reached its climax. Captain Pandey reached a position directly below the main bunker, so close that he could hear the Pakistani soldiers inside shouting instructions to each other. The bunker was constructed with its firing aperture facing down the main approach, but from his position underneath it, there was a blind spot. Using rocks and his remaining strength, he pulled himself upright, standing on trembling legs that threatened to give way at any moment. Blood continued to pour from his shoulder wound, and his vision was blurring, but his right hand still gripped his assault rifle with deadly purpose. According to the detailed accounts compiled by military historians and referenced in publications including the Indian Army's own official history of the Kargil War, what happened next occurred within a span of perhaps 10 seconds, but those seconds would define a legacy that would inspire generations. Captain Pandey stepped around the bunker's edge, exposing himself to point-blank enemy fire, and opened up with his assault rifle, firing through the aperture into the confined space. The enemy soldiers inside, caught completely by surprise from this unexpected angle, were struck down before they could react. But the Pakistani defenders were not finished. A soldier emerged from a secondary position that Captain Pandey hadn't seen, firing his AK-47 rifle at close range. Multiple bullets struck Captain Pandey in the abdomen and chest, the impacts lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward. He fell onto the rocky ground, his rifle clattering away, his body broken beyond any hope of survival. Yet even as he fell, Lance Naik Rai reached the position and eliminated the enemy soldier with a burst from his weapon, then threw grenades into the remaining bunker, silencing it forever. The summit of Khalubar was captured at 10:15 hours on the 4th of July, 1999. The Indian flag was raised over positions that had cost so much blood to secure, fluttering in the mountain wind as a testament to sacrifice and valor. But the victory was bittersweet, for Captain Manoj Kumar Pandey lay dying on the rocks he had fought so hard to capture. His men gathered around him, these hardened Gorkha warriors openly weeping as they tried desperately to stop the bleeding, to somehow save the life of an officer they loved. Captain Pandey remained conscious for a few more minutes, though the pain must have been beyond description. According to the accounts of soldiers who were with him in those final moments, he asked only 2 questions. First, he asked whether the objective had been secured, whether Khalubar was now in Indian hands. When told yes, he smiled. Then he asked about his men, about casualties, about whether the wounded were receiving medical attention. Even dying, his thoughts were for others rather than himself. Those were the priorities of a true leader, maintained until his very last breath. At 10:30 hours on the 4th of July, 1999, Captain Manoj Kumar Pandey, 24 years old, died from his wounds on the summit of Khalubar. His body was carefully wrapped in an Indian flag and carried down the mountain by his Gorkha soldiers, who considered it the highest honor to bear their captain's remains. The journey down took hours, with men taking turns carrying the precious burden, refusing to let anyone outside the company touch their fallen leader. They carried him with tears streaming down their faces, their grief mixed with fierce pride in having served under such a man. The capture of Khalubar was a turning point in the Batalik sector operations. The heights that Captain Pandey and his company had seized controlled several other enemy positions, forcing Pakistani forces to withdraw or risk being cut off. In the days that followed, Indian forces used Khalubar as a base to launch further operations that eventually led to the clearing of the entire sector. Military analysts would later assess that the capture of this single feature shortened the war by weeks and saved hundreds of Indian lives by dominating the surrounding terrain. News of Captain Pandey's sacrifice spread rapidly through the Indian army, and then to the nation beyond. In a country that had watched the Kargil war unfold on television news, that had seen coffins draped in the tricolor returning home almost daily, Captain Pandey's story resonated with particular power. Here was a young officer, barely out of military academy, who had given everything, who had fought on despite mortal wounds, who had placed mission and men above his own survival. The news of Captain Manoj Kumar Pandey's death reached his family home in Rudra, Uttar Pradesh, on the evening of the 5th of July, 1999. His mother, Mohini Pandey, had spent the previous weeks glued to television reports of the Kargil war, knowing her son was in the thick of fighting but hoping and praying for his safe return. When the official messenger arrived in uniform, accompanied by senior officers, she knew before they spoke that her worst fears had been realized. The formal notification, delivered with military precision and compassion, informed the family that Captain Pandey had laid down his life in the service of the nation, fighting with exemplary gallantry and leadership. His father, who had himself served in the army and had instilled military values in his son from childhood, received the news with the stoic dignity expected of a soldier's family. But behind that facade of strength was the unbearable pain of a parent who had sent a child to defend the nation and received back only memories in a flag-draped coffin. His younger brother and sister, who had looked up to Manoj as both sibling and hero, struggled to comprehend that they would never again hear his laugh, receive his letters from the front, or see him walk through the door in his crisp uniform. The body of Captain Pandey was transported from Kargil to his native village, a journey that became an impromptu parade of grief and respect. At every stop along the way, civilians gathered to pay their respects, showering the coffin with flower petals and standing in silent tribute as the convoy passed. In Delhi, where the body was brought for official homage, thousands of people lined the streets despite the oppressive July heat. Senior military commanders, government officials, and ordinary citizens stood shoulder to shoulder, united in mourning for a young man who had become the symbol of everything noble about military service. The funeral procession through the streets of Rudra on the 8th of July, 1999, was attended by an estimated 50,000 people, an extraordinary number for a small town. Schools closed, businesses shuttered their doors, and people from surrounding villages walked miles to be present. The outpouring of public grief was spontaneous and overwhelming, reflecting the deep emotional connection that the Indian people felt to the soldiers fighting in Kargil's frozen heights. Captain Pandey's sacrifice had touched something profound in the national consciousness, reminding a generation that freedom and sovereignty came at a terrible price. The military honors rendered at his funeral were executed with precision and solemnity. The rifle salute cracked through the air, each shot echoing like a thunderclap. The bugler played the last post, that haunting melody that has marked military funerals for generations, its mournful notes seeming to carry the sorrow of all who had lost loved ones in war. When the Indian flag was ceremonially folded and presented to his mother, she held it to her chest, and even the hardest veterans present struggled to maintain their composure. In the weeks following his death, as the Indian Army continued operations to clear the remaining infiltrators from Kargil, the story of Captain Pandey's last battle was pieced together from witness accounts, operational reports, and debriefings of the soldiers who had fought beside him. Military analysts studying the battle noted several instances where his tactical decisions had been unconventional, but brilliant, where his leadership had transformed what should have been a failed assault into a decisive victory. The consensus among professional soldiers was that Captain Pandey had displayed battlefield leadership of the highest order, combining tactical skill with personal courage in equal measure. The official citation for Captain Pandey's Param Veer Chakra, India's highest military decoration for valor, was published in December of 1999. The citation, as documented in official military records and reported in publications including The Times of India, detailed his actions on Khalubar with clinical precision, but even the dry military language could not fully capture the magnitude of his sacrifice. The citation noted that Captain Manoj Pandey led his men in a series of fierce hand-to-hand combats, and that despite being grievously injured, he continued to lead the assault, motivating his command by his own personal example of raw courage and invincible spirit. These words, carved eventually into memorial stones and reprinted in countless military publications, became his epitaph. The Param Veer Chakra was presented posthumously to Captain Pandey's family by the President of India in a solemn ceremony at Rashtrapati Bhavan in New Delhi. His mother, dressed in a simple white sari that symbolized her loss, received the medal with quiet dignity, though her hands trembled as she held the decoration that her son had purchased with his life. The President's citation speech emphasized that Captain Pandey represented the finest traditions of the Indian Armed Forces, that his sacrifice embodied the spirit of selfless service that was the foundation of military honor. Captain Pandey became one of 4 officers awarded the Param Veer Chakra for actions during the Kargil War, joining a select group of Indian military heroes whose courage had gone beyond what any nation had the right to expect from its defenders. The other recipients were Grenadier Yogendra Singh Yadav, Lieutenant Balwan Singh, and Rifleman Sanjay Kumar, all of whom had displayed extraordinary valor in different sectors of the conflict. Together, these men became the human faces of a war that had been fought in some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth, under conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. In the immediate aftermath of the war, as India took stock of its victory and counted the cost, Captain Pandey's story became part of a larger narrative about the Kargil conflict and what it revealed about the Indian military and nation. The war had exposed intelligence failures and strategic gaps, but it had also showcased the incredible fighting spirit of Indian soldiers and junior officers. Men like Captain Pandey had compensated for systemic weaknesses through individual excellence and sacrifice, winning battles through sheer determination and courage. The Indian National Military Academy, where Captain Pandey had trained, established a memorial in his honor, placing his portrait in a position of prominence where every cadet would see it daily. His story became part of the Academy's lore, told to each incoming class as an example of what it meant to lead from the front, to place mission above personal safety, to understand that an officer's commission came with the implicit promise to die if necessary for his men and his country. The soldiers of the 1st Battalion 11th Gorkha Rifles, those who had fought alongside Captain Manoj Pandey on Khalubar and survived to tell the tale, carried the memory of their young captain with them long after the guns fell silent. In the years following the Kargil War, as the battalion rotated through various postings across India, from the insurgency-racked northeast to the tense borders with Pakistan and China, the legend of Captain Pandey remained a living presence within the unit. His name was invoked in difficult moments, his example cited when courage flagged, his leadership style studied and emulated by officers who came after him. Lance Naik Gambhir Rai, who had charged alongside Captain Pandey in those final terrible moments on Khalubar's summit, was himself decorated for gallantry and eventually promoted to the rank of Subedar. In numerous interviews given over the years, Rai spoke about his former commander with a reverence that bordered on worship. He described how Captain Pandey had never asked his men to go anywhere he wouldn't go first, how he had learned basic Nepali to better communicate with his Gorkha soldiers, how he had shared their hardships without complaint despite being their superior officer. These small details, accumulated over time, painted a picture of a leader who had understood that command was not about privilege but about responsibility. The battalion established its own memorial to Captain Pandey at their permanent base, a simple but dignified structure featuring his photograph, the Paramveer Chakra citation, and a relief map of Khalubar marking the key points of the battle. Every year on the 4th of July, the anniversary of his death, the entire battalion assembled for a memorial service that combined military formality with genuine emotion. New recruits were brought to the memorial during their initial training and told the story of Khalubar, ensuring that the legacy passed from generation to generation. The Gorkhas, with their fierce pride and military tradition, guarded Captain Pandey's memory with particular intensity, considering him one of their own despite his not being of Nepali descent. In the broader Indian Army, Captain Pandey's tactics and decisions during the Battle of Khalubar became case studies at the Army War College and other professional military education institutions. Senior officers analyzing the Kargil War identified his leadership as exemplary of the kind of initiative and audacity required in mountain warfare. The fact that he had succeeded against overwhelming odds, in terrain that favored the defender absolutely, while leading a depleted force of exhausted men, made his achievement all the more remarkable. Military theorists noted that his success came not from some revolutionary tactical innovation, but from the application of fundamental principles executed with extraordinary courage and determination. The Kargil War itself was extensively documented in books, documentaries, and official military histories published in the years following the conflict. Works like Kargil From Surprise to Victory by General V.P. Malik, who had been the Indian Army chief during the war, provided comprehensive strategic and tactical analysis. Captain Pandey featured prominently in these accounts, his actions on Khalubar described in detail, alongside other critical battles like Tolaling, Tiger Hill, and Point 4875. Each retelling reinforced his status as one of the war's greatest heroes, ensuring that his name remained synonymous with military excellence. The media also played a significant role in preserving and disseminating Captain Pandey's story. Television documentaries, newspaper feature articles, and eventually social media content kept his sacrifice in the public consciousness. On significant anniversaries of the Kargil War, particularly the 10th, 15th, and 20th, news outlets would run retrospectives that invariably included segments on Captain Pandey and Khalubar. Journalists who specialized in defense reporting sought out veterans of the battle, recording their testimonies before age and time could erase these primary sources forever. Captain Pandey's family, despite their grief, became custodians of his legacy in their own right. His mother, Mohini Pandey, gave numerous interviews over the years, speaking about her son's childhood, his determination to serve in the army, and the pride she felt despite the unbearable pain of loss. She established that while she mourned her son every day, she had never regretted his choice to serve, that she understood his sacrifice had meaning beyond their family's personal tragedy. This dignified acceptance of fate, while never ceasing to grieve, provided solace to other military families facing similar losses. The Indian government, recognizing the powerful symbolism that Captain Pandey represented, ensured that his story was incorporated into national narrative about the Kargil War and military service in general. When the Kargil War Memorial was inaugurated in Dras in 2003, Captain Pandey's name was inscribed prominently on the memorial wall, alongside the 527 other soldiers who had died in the conflict. The wall, visible from the highway that their sacrifice had helped keep open, stood as a permanent reminder of the price of sovereignty. Educational institutions across India began incorporating the stories of Kargil heroes, including Captain Pandey, into their curricula. Schools organized essay competitions, debates, and commemorative events around Kargil Vijay Diwas, celebrated annually on the 26th of July to mark the successful conclusion of Operation Vijay. Students learned that patriotism wasn't an abstract concept, but something that real people, some barely older than themselves, had died to defend. Captain Pandey, who had been just 24 when he fell, was particularly relatable to young Indians coming of age in the early 21st century. The cultural impact extended to popular media as well. Bollywood films about the Kargil War, such as LOC Kargil, released in 2003, and Lakshya, released in 2004, while not specifically about Captain Pandey, were influenced by the stories of valor that had emerged from the conflict. These films introduced a new generation to the reality of high-altitude warfare and the sacrifices made by soldiers in India's defense. While cinematic dramatization could never fully capture the reality of combat, these films sparked national conversations about military service and sacrifice. In the Sikh and Gorkha communities, which had contributed disproportionately to the Kargil fighting force and casualties, Captain Pandey was remembered with particular honor during community gatherings and military-related commemorations. The Gorkha regiments, with their long and distinguished history in the Indian and British armies, had added another glorious chapter to their regimental legacy through the actions of men like Captain Pandey's soldiers on Khalubar. The bonds forged in that battle strengthened the already deep connection between Gorkha soldiers and the Indian Army. The years following the Kargil War saw the Indian government and military establish numerous physical memorials to honor those who had fought and died in the conflict. In the Batalik sector, where Captain Manoj Pandey had made his final stand, a memorial was erected near the base of Khalubar, marking the site where Indian forces had launched their assault on the 3rd and 4th of July, 1999. The memorial, constructed from local stone and designed to withstand the harsh Himalayan climate, featured plaques detailing the battle and listing the names of soldiers from the 1st Battalion 11th Gorkha Rifles who had fallen in the operation. Khalubar itself, the mountain that had been the site of such ferocious combat, remained in military control with bunkers and observation posts maintained by Indian forces. Soldiers posted to these positions learned about the battle that had secured the heights they now occupied. The actual ground where Captain Pandey had fought, where he had crawled forward despite his wounds, where he had made his final assault, became something of a pilgrimage site for military personnel. Officers and soldiers serving in the sector would visit the location, standing where their predecessor had stood, trying to imagine the courage required to do what he had done. In Captain Pandey's home district of Sitapur in Uttar Pradesh, the state government undertook several initiatives to honor his memory. The main government inter-college in Sitapur was renamed Captain Manoj Kumar Pandey Government Inter-College, ensuring that thousands of students would be educated under his name and example. A statue was erected in the heart of the town, depicting Captain Pandey in combat uniform, his gaze fixed determinedly forward, his posture suggesting forward movement into danger. The statue became a landmark and a source of local pride, with residents bringing visitors to see it and recount the story of their local hero who had achieved the nation's highest military honor. The Indian Army's regimental system, which fostered deep loyalty and institutional memory within individual units, ensured that Captain Pandey's legacy remained vibrant within the 11th Gorkha Rifles. The regiment compiled comprehensive histories that devoted entire chapters to the Kargil operations, with particular emphasis on Khalubar. These histories, maintained in both English and Nepali, served as teaching tools for new officers posted to the regiment. Young lieutenants and captains were expected to study the battle, to understand the tactical decisions made under pressure, to internalize the leadership principles that Captain Pandey had demonstrated. The National Defense Academy in Kadakwasla, where Captain Pandey had begun his military education, incorporated his story into its leadership curriculum. The institution, which had produced generations of Indian military officers since its establishment in 1954, held up Captain Pandey as an exemplar of the Academy's values. His coursemates, who had trained alongside him and gone on to their own distinguished careers, often spoke at Academy functions about the young cadet who had shown early signs of the leader he would become. They recalled his academic excellence, his athletic prowess, and most importantly, his character traits of integrity and selflessness that had marked him even in his teenage years. The Indian Military Academy in Dehradun, where Captain Pandey had completed his final training before commissioning, established the Captain Manoj Kumar Pandey Memorial Lecture Series in 2005. This annual event brought distinguished military leaders, defense analysts, and scholars to speak on topics related to leadership, tactics, and military ethics. The lecture series became one of the Academy's most prestigious events, attended by cadets, faculty, and senior military officials. Each lecture began with a brief recounting of Captain Pandey's actions at Khalubar, contextualizing the discussion that followed within the framework of his example. At the national level, Captain Pandey's name became inseparable from discussions about military valor and the Paramveer Chakra. When the Ministry of Defense published commemorative materials about India's highest military decoration, Captain Pandey featured prominently alongside other recipients like Major Somnath Sharma from the 1947 Kashmir operations, Naik Jadunath Singh from the 1947 Nowshera battle, and Captain Vikram Batra, another Kargil hero who had died capturing Point 4875. These men, spanning different eras and conflicts, represented a continuum of sacrifice that defined India's military tradition. The academic study of the Kargil War, which intensified in the decade following the conflict, repeatedly highlighted Captain Pandey's actions as militarily significant beyond their symbolic value. Strategic studies departments at universities, defense research institutes, and military staff colleges produced numerous papers analyzing various aspects of the Kargil operations. Scholars noted that the capture of Khalubar had been operationally crucial, that it had opened up subsequent advances in the Batalik sector, and that it had been achieved through conventional infantry tactics, executed with exceptional leadership and courage. The battle became a standard reference point in discussions of mountain warfare, small unit tactics, and combat leadership. International military observers and historians studying the Kargil War also took note of Captain Pandey's achievement. Military journals in the United States, United Kingdom, and other nations published analyses of the conflict that referenced the Battle of Khalubar as an example of determined offensive action in extremely challenging terrain. The professional respect accorded by foreign military establishments added another dimension to Captain Pandey's legacy, demonstrating that military valor transcended national boundaries and could be appreciated by any professional soldier, regardless of nationality. The rise of digital media and social networking in the 2010s brought Captain Pandey's story to a new generation of Indians who consumed information primarily through online platforms. YouTube channels devoted to military history created detailed videos about the Kargil War that garnered millions of views, with episodes focusing specifically on Captain Pandey and Khalubar. These videos, often featuring interviews with veterans, battlefield footage, and animated tactical maps, made the story accessible to young people who might never read a military history book, but who responded to visual storytelling. Social media accounts dedicated to military affairs regularly posted about Captain Pandey on significant dates like his birth anniversary, death anniversary, and Kargil Vijay Diwas. These posts, shared thousands of times, kept his memory circulating in public consciousness. The comment sections of such posts revealed the deep emotional connection that ordinary Indians felt to Captain Pandey and other Kargil martyrs, with people expressing pride, gratitude, and renewed commitment to supporting the armed forces. The digital age had created new forms of commemoration that complemented traditional physical memorials. The Indian Army's own digital presence contributed significantly to preserving and propagating Captain Pandey's legacy. The Army's official website, social media accounts, and YouTube channel regularly featured content about Kargil heroes. On the 20th anniversary of the Kargil War in 2019, the Army launched a comprehensive digital campaign that included detailed battle accounts, veteran testimonials, and educational resources. Captain Pandey's story was central to this campaign, reaching audiences across India and among the Indian diaspora worldwide. Educational documentaries produced by the History Channel, India, Discovery India, and other networks devoted significant airtime to the Kargil War and its heroes. These professionally produced programs, featuring interviews with military experts, computer-generated battle recreations, and footage from the actual conflict, brought Captain Pandey's story into millions of households. The visual medium proved particularly powerful in conveying the difficulty of the terrain, the intensity of the combat, and the magnitude of the sacrifice, elements that were harder to appreciate through written accounts alone. The commemoration of Captain Pandey's sacrifice intersected with broader Indian societal trends regarding military service and civilian-military relations. In the years following Kargil, there was a noticeable increase in public respect and appreciation for the armed forces, partly driven by the stories of valor that had emerged from the conflict. Captain Pandey and his fellow Paramveer Chakra recipients became cultural icons, their images appearing on postage stamps, their stories featured in textbooks, their examples invoked by politicians and public figures across the ideological spectrum. Beyond the military citations, the medals, and the memorials, Captain Manoj Kumar Pandey had been a real person with dreams, relationships, and a life that extended beyond his final moments of glory. Understanding the man behind the legend required looking at the formative experiences and personal qualities that had shaped him into the officer who could lead men into what he must have known was a suicide mission. His family, friends, and course mates provided glimpses into a personality that combined intellectual curiosity, physical courage, and genuine compassion for others. Born on the 25th of June 1975 in Sitapur, Uttar Pradesh, Manoj Kumar Pandey grew up in a middle-class family where education and service were valued highly. His father's military background meant that young Manoj was exposed from childhood to stories of military life, to the values of discipline and duty, to the understanding that some callings were more important than personal comfort or safety. But his father never pushed him toward the military. Rather, Manoj's interest in army life developed organically as he grew older and began to understand what military service represented. As a student at Kendriya Vidyalaya in Lucknow, Manoj excelled academically, particularly in subjects like history and geography. His teachers remembered him as intellectually curious but not bookish, someone who balanced academic achievement with sports and social activities. He was popular among his classmates, known for his sense of humor and his willingness to help others with their studies. Friends from his school days recalled that even then, Manoj had exhibited leadership qualities, organizing sports teams, leading school projects, and standing up against bullying when he witnessed it. The decision to pursue a military career crystallized during his high school years. Manoj began preparing for the National Defense Academy entrance examination with characteristic thoroughness, balancing his regular studies with the specific requirements of the NDA exam. His family supported his ambition, though his mother harbored natural concerns about the dangers of military life. When he received his acceptance letter to the NDA in 1992, at the age of 17, the family celebrated what they knew would be the beginning of a transformative journey. Life at the National Defense Academy in Kadakwasla proved challenging but rewarding for Cadet Manoj Pandey. The Academy's rigorous program, designed to transform teenagers into military officers, tested every aspect of his character and capabilities. The physical training was demanding, the academic workload substantial, and the military discipline unforgiving. Yet Manoj thrived in this environment, distinguishing himself in both classroom studies and field exercises. His course mates recalled that he approached every challenge with enthusiasm and determination, never complaining about hardships that many found overwhelming. During his years at NDA, Manoj developed the philosophical framework that would guide his actions as an officer. He read extensively about military history, studying the campaigns of great commanders and the acts of individual soldiers who had distinguished themselves in battle. He was particularly drawn to accounts of the Victoria Cross and the Paramveer Chakra, studying what had motivated men to perform acts of extraordinary courage. Friends remembered conversations where Manoj articulated his belief that military leadership was fundamentally about caring for one's men, about earning their trust through shared hardship, about never asking them to do something you wouldn't do yourself. After passing out from NDA, Cadet Pandey moved to the Indian Military Academy in Dehradun for his final year of training before commissioning. At IMA, the focus shifted from foundational education to practical military skills and leadership development. Here, Manoj's tactical acumen became evident during field exercises, where he demonstrated an instinctive understanding of terrain, enemy capabilities, and the effective employment of infantry forces. His instructors noted him as a promising officer with the potential for distinguished service, though none could have predicted just how distinguished that service would be. Commissioned into the 1st Battalion 11th Gorkha Rifles in June of 1997, 2nd Lieutenant Manoj Kumar Pandey joined a regiment with a distinguished history dating back to the early 19th century. The Gorkha regiments had earned legendary status through their service in multiple wars and conflicts, and joining one was considered both an honor and a challenge. Pandey had to earn the respect of soldiers who came from a different cultural background, who spoke a different language, and who had their own proud military traditions. He approached this challenge by learning Nepali, by respecting Gorkha customs, and by demonstrating through actions rather than words that he was worthy of leading them. His letters home during his early service revealed a young officer finding his footing, dealing with the mundane challenges of garrison life, training exercises, and administrative duties that constituted most of peacetime military service. He wrote about his soldiers with affection and respect, describing their skills, their humor, and their dedication. He mentioned the physical challenges of mountain training, the beauty of the Himalayan postings, and his growing confidence in his abilities as a leader. These letters, preserved by his family, showed the development of an officer who was maturing rapidly through experience and responsibility. Promoted to lieutenant and then to captain, Pandey's career progressed normally for a capable young officer. He attended professional courses, served in different types of postings, and accumulated the experience necessary for command. His superiors' reports consistently praised his initiative, his concern for his men's welfare, and his tactical competence. There was nothing in his peacetime service to suggest impending heroism, because heroism emerges not from normal circumstances but from extraordinary ones. Yet the qualities that would define his actions at Khalubar, the selflessness, the courage, the determination, were already present, simply waiting for circumstances that would demand their fullest expression. In his personal life, Captain Pandey maintained close connections with his family despite the demands of military service. He called home regularly, visited whenever leave permitted, and remained involved in his younger siblings' lives, offering advice and encouragement. His mother treasured these interactions, not knowing that each visit might be the last, that the next phone call might be replaced by a telegram. He had hopes and plans for the future, normal dreams of career advancement, of marriage and family, of experiences yet to come. These dreams would die with him on Khalubar, sacrificed for a cause larger than personal happiness. Friends from his NDA and IMA days who had gone on to serve in other units maintained contact with Captain Pandey, through letters and occasional meetings when postings aligned. These friendships, forged in the crucible of military training, represented bonds that few civilians could understand. They discussed professional matters, shared experiences from their respective units, and maintained the camaraderie that was one of the great rewards of military life. After Kargil, these friends would struggle with survivor's guilt, wondering why they had survived while Manoj had fallen, a common psychological burden among those who lose comrades in war. The Captain Pandey who reported for operations in the Kargil sector in June of 1999 was, in many ways, an ordinary young officer, one among thousands serving in the Indian Army. He was not superhuman, not uniquely gifted with abilities beyond those of his peers. What distinguished him was not what he possessed but what he chose to do when circumstances demanded everything he had and more. The transformation from capable officer to legend occurred not over years but over hours, compressed into the intense crucible of combat where character reveals itself in its truest form. The Kargil War concluded officially on the 26th of July 1999, when the Indian Army announced that it had cleared the last major infiltrator positions from Indian territory. Operation Vijay, as the military operation was designated, had lasted approximately 3 months from when the intrusions were first discovered in early May to the final clearance in late July. The conflict had cost India 527 soldiers killed, over 1,400 wounded, and had required the mobilization of significant military resources at a time when such a conventional conflict had seemed unlikely in the nuclear age. The strategic implications of the Kargil War extended far beyond the immediate tactical outcomes. Pakistan's intrusion had been a spectacular intelligence failure for India, revealing gaps in surveillance and assessment that required urgent correction. In the war's aftermath, the Indian government established the Kargil Review Committee, headed by strategic analyst K. Subramaniam, to conduct a comprehensive examination of what had gone wrong and what needed to change. The committee's report, submitted in December of 1999 and later declassified in part, recommended sweeping reforms in intelligence gathering, inter-service coordination, and military preparedness. For the Indian Army specifically, Kargil had been both a vindication and a wake-up call. The vindication came from the extraordinary courage and tactical competence displayed by junior officers and soldiers who had overcome tremendous odds to reclaim every inch of occupied territory. Battles like Khalubar, Tololing, Tiger Hill, and Point 4875 had demonstrated that Indian soldiers, properly led, could achieve seemingly impossible objectives. The wake-up call concerned equipment deficiencies, artillery shortages, and the lack of precision-guided munitions that might have reduced casualties during operations. The political consequences in Pakistan were severe. Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, who claimed he had not been fully informed about the extent of the military operation, found himself in an increasingly untenable position. The military establishment that had planned and executed the Kargil intrusion faced criticism for strategic overreach and for failing to anticipate the Indian military response and international diplomatic reaction. By October of 1999, less than 3 months after the war's conclusion, General Pervez Musharraf, the architect of the Kargil operation, had overthrown Sharif's government in a military coup, a development that many analysts linked directly to the Kargil conflict's outcome. Internationally, the Kargil War had demonstrated the dangerous potential for escalation between two nuclear-armed adversaries. The United States and other major powers had watched with alarm as India and Pakistan, both of which had conducted nuclear tests in 1998, engaged in conventional warfare that could potentially spiral into nuclear conflict. American diplomatic intervention, particularly President Bill Clinton's meeting with Prime Minister Sharif on the 4th of July, had been crucial in persuading Pakistan to withdraw. But the episode had highlighted the fragility of South Asian stability. Within India, the Kargil War had profound social and cultural impacts that reverberated for years. The conflict, extensively covered by television news in a way that previous Indian wars had not been, brought the reality of combat into living rooms across the nation. Indians watched coffins arriving at airports, attended funerals of local martyrs, and developed a renewed appreciation for military service. The post-Kargil period saw increased respect for the armed forces, greater public support for defense spending, and heightened awareness of the sacrifices made by military families. The stories of individual heroes like Captain Manoj Pandey became integral to how Indians understood and remembered the Kargil War. Unlike World War I or World War II, which involved millions of soldiers and could seem impersonal in their vastness, Kargil was a conflict where individual acts of valor had direct operational significance. The capture of Khalubar, Point 4875, Tololing, and other features depended not on overwhelming force, but on small groups of soldiers led by junior officers who displayed extraordinary leadership. This made the human element central to the narrative, and personalities like Captain Pandey became the lens through which the broader conflict was understood. The Defense Ministry's decision to award 4 Param Veer Chakras for the Kargil War, more than had been awarded for any single conflict since the decoration's institution in 1950, underscored the exceptional nature of the courage displayed. Captain Pandey shared this honor with Grenadier Yogendra Singh Yadav, who had survived despite being shot multiple times while climbing toward an enemy bunker, Lieutenant Balwan Singh, who had led a successful assault on a critical position, and Rifleman Sanjay Kumar, who had neutralized enemy bunkers in close combat. Together, these men represented different aspects of military valor. From Yadav's near-superhuman endurance to Captain Pandey's sacrificial leadership, the years following Kargil saw significant changes in how India approached its defense and security. The government created the post of Chief of Defense Staff to improve inter-service coordination, a recommendation that took until December of 2019 to implement fully, but which originated in the Kargil Review Committee's findings. The Army invested heavily in mountain warfare equipment, artillery modernization, and surveillance technologies designed to prevent another surprise intrusion. The Siachen Glacier conflict and the line of control were subjected to much more intensive monitoring to ensure that what had happened in Kargil could never be repeated. For military families, Kargil represented both pride and pain. The Pandey family, like hundreds of others, had to navigate the complex emotions of public honor and private grief. They attended commemorative events, gave interviews, and served as symbols of sacrifice, all while dealing with the personal loss that no amount of public recognition could truly mitigate. Mrs. Mohini Pandey spoke at military functions and educational institutions, her presence a powerful reminder of the cost that families paid when their sons chose military service. Her dignity in grief became its own form of inspiration, teaching that sacrifice had meaning even when the pain never fully subsided. The 11th Gorkha Rifles, which had lost multiple soldiers at Khalubar and in other Kargil operations, incorporated these experiences into its institutional culture. The regiment's Kargil veterans became senior leaders within the unit, passing down lessons learned and maintaining the fighting spirit that had characterized their actions during the war. When the regiment deployed to counterinsurgency operations, peacekeeping missions, or training exercises, the standards set at Khalubar served as benchmarks for performance and courage. In the broader context of India-Pakistan relations, Kargil represented a significant inflection point. The conflict had occurred just months after the Lahore summit, where the prime ministers of both nations had met to discuss peace initiatives. The betrayal implicit in launching the Kargil intrusion while peace talks were underway poisoned diplomatic relations for years afterward. It would take until 2004 for dialogue to resume seriously, and even then, the memory of Kargil cast a shadow over peace processes. The conflict demonstrated that without fundamental resolution of Kashmir and other disputes, the potential for military confrontation remained constant. The strategic community in India engaged in extensive analysis of what the Kargil War revealed about modern mountain warfare, limited conflict under the nuclear umbrella, and the importance of intelligence and surveillance. Academic journals, defense think tanks, and military institutions produced countless papers, books, and conference presentations dissecting every aspect of the conflict. Captain Pandey's actions at Khalubar appeared repeatedly in these analyses as an example of tactical excellence under extreme constraints, providing a case study for military professionals studying leadership and small unit operations. 25 years after the Battle of Khalubar, the legacy of Captain Manoj Pandey continued to resonate within the Indian Armed Forces and the broader national consciousness. The passage of time had not diminished his story's power. If anything, it had enhanced it, as successive generations discovered his sacrifice and drew inspiration from it. In an era marked by rapid technological change, geopolitical complexity, and evolving security threats, the fundamental values that Captain Pandey embodied, courage, selflessness, duty, and leadership, remained as relevant as ever. The Indian Army of 2024 was vastly different from the army that had fought at Kargil. It was better equipped, with modern artillery, precision-guided munitions, advanced surveillance systems, and improved mountain warfare gear. It had incorporated lessons learned from Kargil into its operational doctrines and training regimens. Yet the core remained unchanged. Armies still depended on soldiers willing to climb mountains under fire, on officers willing to lead from the front, on the human qualities that no amount of technology could replace. In this context, Captain Pandey's example retained its instructional value, teaching that technology enabled, but did not determine outcomes in combat. The military education system continued to study the Battle of Khalubar with undiminished interest. At the Indian Military Academy, National Defense Academy, and various command and staff colleges, the tactical decisions made during the battle were analyzed in minute detail. Students debated alternative courses of action, examined the risks Captain Pandey had accepted, and considered how they might have acted in similar circumstances. These exercises went beyond mere tactical study. They were fundamentally about character development, about preparing future officers to make the kinds of decisions that required placing mission and men above personal survival. The families of Kargil martyrs, including the Pandey family, had formed associations that worked to preserve the memory of the conflict and support veterans and families facing similar losses in subsequent operations. These organizations organized annual gatherings where stories were shared, where younger family members could connect with their heritage, and where the bonds forged in shared sacrifice could be maintained. The associations also advocated for improved benefits and support systems for military families, ensuring that the nation's commitment to those who served extended beyond rhetoric to practical assistance. In popular culture, the Kargil War and its heroes experienced periodic resurgence in public attention, particularly around significant anniversaries. The 20th anniversary in 2019 had been marked by major commemorative events, including a special ceremony at the Kargil War Memorial attended by the Prime Minister and senior military leadership. The 25th anniversary in 2024 prompted renewed media coverage, with streaming platforms releasing documentaries and dramatic series based on Kargil battles. Captain Pandey featured prominently in these productions, his story told and retold for audiences who had not been born when he made his sacrifice. The physical memorials to Captain Pandey and other Kargil heroes had become pilgrimage sites for military enthusiasts, students, and ordinary citizens seeking to connect with this chapter of national history. The Kargil War Memorial in Dras, located at one of the world's coldest inhabited places, received thousands of visitors annually despite its remote location and harsh climate. Visitors stood before the memorial wall inscribed with names, trying to imagine the battles that had raged on the surrounding peaks, paying their respects to men they had never known, but whose sacrifices had shaped the nation they lived in. The strategic significance of Kargil and the heights that had been recaptured at such cost remained undiminished. The Indian Army maintained robust defenses throughout the region, with positions on Khalubar and similar features continuously manned and supplied. Soldiers posted to these locations served in the shadow of history, walking ground where legendary battles had occurred, maintaining vigilance along a border that remained disputed and dangerous. For them, Captain Pandey was not an abstract historical figure but a predecessor whose standards they were expected to uphold. The broader lessons of Kargil about intelligence failures, the need for military preparedness, and the dangers of complacency continued to inform Indian defense policy. The conflict had taught that peace could not be assumed, that adversaries might launch operations without warning, and that the price of territorial sovereignty was constant vigilance. These lessons influenced force structuring decisions, intelligence priorities, and the allocation of defense resources. Every rupee spent on mountain warfare equipment, surveillance technology, or artillery modernization could be traced back, in part, to lessons learned in the summer of 1999. For the Gorkha community, both in Nepal and in India, Captain Pandey represented the finest traditions of Gorkha military service. Though not ethnically Gorkha himself, his command of Gorkha soldiers and his death alongside them had earned him honorary status within the community. Gorkha veterans spoke of him with the same pride they reserved for their own ethnic heroes, recognizing that true brotherhood transcended ethnicity and was forged in shared combat. This intercultural respect was emblematic of the Indian Army's ability to unite diverse groups under common cause and shared values. The Param Veer Chakra that Captain Pandey had earned remained India's highest military decoration, awarded sparingly only for the most exceptional acts of valor. In the quarter-century since Kargil, the decoration had been awarded only a handful of times, each recipient joining an exclusive fraternity of heroes. When new awardees were announced, comparisons were inevitably drawn to previous recipients, and Captain Pandey's name invariably appeared in those discussions, his actions at Khalubar serving as a benchmark against which other acts of courage were measured. Educational institutions continued to find value in teaching Captain Pandey's story to students across India. Beyond its military significance, the story offered lessons about leadership applicable in any field, about the importance of leading by example, about making decisions based on principles rather than self-interest, about understanding that some responsibilities transcended personal considerations. Business schools, leadership programs, and motivational seminars drew on military examples like Captain Pandey's to illustrate these points, finding universal themes in a very specific military context. The question of what motivated men like Captain Pandey to perform acts of extraordinary courage continued to fascinate psychologists, military sociologists, and those studying human behavior under extreme stress. Some pointed to training and indoctrination, to the values instilled by military education. Others emphasized unit cohesion and the bonds between soldiers that made it unthinkable to abandon comrades. Still others focused on individual personality traits, the possession of certain character qualities that enabled exceptional performance when others might have faltered. The truth, as is often the case, likely involved all these factors interacting in complex ways that reduced poorly to simple explanations. What remained indisputable was the outcome. Captain Manoj Pandey, faced with a choice between personal survival and mission accomplishment, between seeking medical evacuation and continuing to lead his men, chose the latter despite knowing what that choice would cost him. In making that choice, he joined a lineage of military heroes extending back through human history, men and women who had decided that some things were worth dying for, that duty and honor were not empty words but imperatives that could demand everything. On the 3rd and 4th of July each year, ceremonies were held at multiple locations to commemorate the Battle of Khalubar and Captain Pandey's sacrifice. At the regimental center of the 11th Gorkha Rifles, at the memorial in Sitapur, at the military academy where he had trained, and at the actual site of the battle, people gathered to remember. These ceremonies followed similar formats: the laying of wreaths, the playing of the last post, moments of silence, and speeches honoring the fallen. Yet the rituals repeated annually never became merely routine. Each year brought new participants, young soldiers and officers learning about the standards they were expected to uphold, families remembering loved ones, veterans reconnecting with memories both cherished and painful. The story of Captain Manoj Pandey and the Battle of Khalubar had become part of India's national narrative, one of those historical episodes that helped define how the nation understood itself and its values. In a country as diverse and complex as India, with its multitude of languages, religions, and regional identities, stories of national significance that transcended local particularities were precious. Captain Pandey's sacrifice, made in service of national sovereignty and territorial integrity, provided such a narrative, one that Indians from all backgrounds could embrace as their own. As India moved deeper into the 21st century, facing new security challenges from cyber warfare to terrorism to great power competition, the fundamental questions that Captain Pandey had answered through action remained relevant. What did citizenship demand? What were the responsibilities of those who enjoyed the rights and freedoms that sovereignty provided? What did it mean to serve something larger than oneself? These questions, eternal in their essence, required each generation to find its own answers. For those seeking guidance, the example of a 24-year-old captain climbing a mountain into enemy fire, fighting on despite mortal wounds, and giving his last breath to secure his objective, provided a standard that was simultaneously inspiring and humbling. The Battle of Khalubar had been decided by human courage and will, by leadership and sacrifice, by men who refused to accept defeat despite impossible odds. In that sense, it was timeless, a reminder that while tactics and technologies changed, the human dimensions of warfare remained constant. Captain Manoj Pandey had understood this instinctively, had known that his men would follow where he led, that courage was contagious, that the example of one man placing duty above life could inspire others to transcend their own limitations. His understanding had proven correct, had enabled an outnumbered and exhausted force to achieve victory, had changed the course of a battle and shortened a war. In the final analysis, Captain Pandey's legacy resided not in memorials or medals, important as those were, but in the continuing inspiration his example provided to serving soldiers, to military leaders, and to citizens seeking to understand what the defense of their nation required. His story reminded all who heard it that freedom was not free, that sovereignty had a price, and that in every generation, some individuals must be willing to pay that price in full. He had done so without complaint, without hesitation, without anything but determination to complete his mission and care for his men. That example, preserved in memory and honored in ceremony, remained as powerful a quarter-century later as it had been in the moment of its occurrence, and it would continue to inspire as long as humans valued courage, duty, and selfless service to causes greater than individual survival.